I think it has always been the role of art and embodiment and ceremony to tend the continuity of culture. And we are at a moment where, like, one of the things I say in True Human is be ready for a renaissance. And what might a renaissance look like if it was a global renaissance of remembering of our place within the biospheric process? That is like the most exquisite, miraculous, sense-making thing about what it is to be a human organism. Not just that we are humans together, but that we are humans tied in a mutual destiny. Yesterday was Martin Luther King Day, and he spoke of the fabric of destiny that we are all mutually bound to. And but that destiny is larger than us. It's this Gaian process that's absolutely miraculous, and that we can be in discourse with through our song, through our art, through our dance. Um, I think there's a potential for that, and that tending those nodes of coherence is the way to start. And then asking, how does the invitation extend itself? How does the medicine become shared with more people?
Hi, I'm Rudy, and this is Voices of Emergence. Together with my co-host Alex de Carvalho, we are honored to welcome Samantha Sweetwater, a wisdom guide, author of True Human, and founder of One Life Circle, a ministry of remembering. She works at the fertile nexus where unraveling systems make way for emerging forms of kinship, leadership, and value. For over 3 decades, she has facilitated individuals and organizations across 5 continents through journeys of personal, cultural, ecological, and spiritual emergence. She mentors leaders in business, technology, and finance, helping them to navigate awakening, develop systemic wisdom, and align impact with regenerative futures. Through her writing, public dialogues, and True Human, Samantha invites us to step beyond inherited economic, technological, and cultural assumptions, and to cultivate new forms of maturity, responsibility, and meaning suited to the realities of the 21st century. Her voice is both sobering and hopeful, grounded in realism while opening space for possibility beyond collapse or techno-optimism. Today we explore what it means to become truly human, not as an ideal or identity, but as a lived price of remembrance, responsibility, and relationship in a world that is asking us to grow up together. Welcome, Samantha.
Thanks for having me here. It's a delight.
Likewise. And our first question we ask to all our guests is, when you hear the word emergence, what does that evoke in you right now?
Oh, it invokes both excitement and this kind of tremulous sense of concern. I think I sit in sort of 2 fields of sensing in relationship to the word emergence, and one is the word that I think of is aethanopoiesis, which is Nora Bateson's creation. And it refers to the invisible vitality that is often coalescing prior to our ability to see it. You know, in the classic example is the way a seed, is sprouts and is starting to coalesce the possibility for fruit before we ever see the plant, and I feel that in many ways because intelligent people are observing what's going on and finding so many ways to strengthen relationality and engage in the intelligent critique of the systemic dynamics and seek to design in other directions. And that's happening in governance, and it's happening in business, and it's happening in technology, and it's happening in communities. And I'm seeing that a lot in my communities. And then the other place that I sit with emergence is the other side of ephanypoesis is insidious. And, I think that there's things that are emerging that are systemic, extremely fast-moving systemic forces that are coalescing, not in a conspiratorial way, but in a systemic way, in ways that are really terrifying. So I think of both things when I think of emergence. Like what is going on in my country is a function of emergence in some ways of inevitability within a collection of systemic factors. So I think of both of those things.
Thank you. Was there a moment when you realized that the dominant narratives of progress and growth no longer made sense to you? Uh, and what drew you thinking about systems and limits and transitions and civilizations?
Oh, I think I've had that insight for a long time. I think I am a person who was partly raised by early environmentalists who, in some ways, mm, understood the the traps, the multipolar traps that we are systemically embedded within from a very early age. And I also was raised in the time of the Cold War and had the insight that we were inside a geopolitical system where the press of a button could end life, and that could happen somewhat even accidentally. Um, and so I think from a very young age, I had a critique of this system, and I think that's been developmentally very central to who and what I am. Um, so I don't really know a time when I didn't have that, but I think that has grown over the course of a lifetime in a very nonlinear way. Um, where I meet other people like yourselves who have kind of had a sea change later in life. And um, one of the things I love in communities like we are all a part of is that there's the ontological reckoning with our embeddedness in in a system that is anti-life is an ongoing process. Because even the construct of a Zoom call and the power that's powering it and the materials that are enabling it are bound up in a multipolar trap system that is affecting people. It has all kinds of outsourced harm. And so I think that process is an ongoing process of like doing the math and attuning to what is possible. You know.
Yeah, very recognizable. Personal, I was in working in technology with a lot of startups, and I also grew up I grew up in the '60s, have known also the Cold War, and have known different decades of how we got to the system that we are in now. And for me personally, it came when I was in Singularity University, and where everything was about exponential technologies at that time, and I felt my heart actually was aching of like, oh, there is something off here. Where is the human part? And then it still took me a couple of years until actually I realized at the moment that whatever I have been working all my life in innovation, but I realized at a certain moment that there was always innovation on the outside. I had this insight that I need to innovate myself, right? And then I went on that journey also. So, uh, and that includes many things. So I also wonder, like, what is your journey like? How you got to where you are? Like, were there any cathartic moments, or was it more like stories building up, narratives and insights and decisions you took along the way? Would you like to share that with us?
Sure. There's so many punctuated moments in my journey. I think centrally, there's a couple questions that have driven my inquiry. And one is what is home? And in in my sensing of that since high school, actually, I was exploring that question as a choreographer and an artist, and um, I created choreographic processes out of state-based experience, holotropic experience that I was facilitating kids in. And this was an innovation that came out of me, and no one taught me how to do it. And it became really clear to me from a very early age, intuitively, that home was both something like in the Ram Dass sense of walking each other home. Home was both something internal, and a state and a trait that we could cultivate to feel at home, to be at home, to be at home within oneself. But it was also something implicitly social and ecological. It was implicitly something relational that it was then our responsibility to enact our attune to what personally constitutes homefulness, not just in the interiority, but in the relational field, and to ask for it and cultivate it and share it. And I think that early work around home and homecoming and doing that in community, which drove a career as a community developer and choreographer and dancer in San Francisco. My first career was very, very intensely anchored in the Thich Nhat Hanh kind of vision of community as the next Buddha. And the prophecy of Maitreya, that is a prophecy that is oriented towards the way in which emergent Buddha lives in the collective, not in the individual. And I see that mirrored in decentralized and distributed technology and the work we're doing right now to distribute governance. Like that, to me, is a technocultural instantiation of Maitreya. So I would say that there was a collection of experiences and insights and emergent, you could say innovation, but these things that I was doing as a kid, that as a teenager, that came out of nowhere, that has really defined my path. And then another very definitive moment for me was a former partner, someone like one of the loves of my life, having a spiritually driven spiritual emergency, having a psychotic break. And I was 29, and this person could have killed me. They were in a really violent breakdown. And that, I would say further, it shattered my orientation towards transcendence as a refuge and put me on a path that was like this even deeper inquiry about how do I come home psychospiritually, with taking the body and the psyche and limitation like deeply seriously, taking my belonging to this life as the fundament of my practice. And how do I then share that with other people? Because what I was witnessing was particularly in the yoga community, and not just yoga asana, but yoga meditation, like the deep meditation community, this orientation towards transcendence being the solutionary path to the conundrum of our humanity. And I was then quite sure that that was not true. And so that took me more deeply into psychological integration and somatic integration and ecological, my already deep attunement to our relationship with world, the reality we share, that that has been a deeply definitive experience. And then there's been more subtly punctuated experiences with indigenous teachers and with plant medicines, and also with audacious, large-scale, multi-stakeholder collaborative processes that have not succeeded, but that have been the kinds of experiments that we need to do and continue to do to humble into who we can be and who we need to be to find our way through this together. Yeah. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
What I hear in your response is that there's not an ideology. It's more of a capacity building. Like, how do we as humans build new capacities, and especially moments of transition, what are those capacities and how do we, become more relational? How do we deal with conflicting narratives and psychosis and capture by narratives? Even the narrative of transcendence, is that real or not? Does that serve us as humans, or is embodiment just as important as transcendence? And how do we balance that? So how does that land with you, this idea of capacity building, and how does that relate to your book?
I think capacity building is a domain that's critical. I think I take the view, and one could call it an ideology, that life is sacred and that the thing that is worth doing with a human life is to organize our time, energy, attention, our capacity towards participating in the continuity and emergence of life's song, of the livingness of this Gaian project, and the even the singing of technology back to life as a reciprocal song. This possibility of the singing of economy back to life as a reciprocal song rather than an extractive and degrading one. And um, so capacity building in that is crucial. Um, and there is an orientation that you could say is ideological, you could say it's biospiritual, you could say it's deeply pragmatic. That the I think ultimately, while my work is very poetic and sometimes kind of lofty, it's also extremely pragmatic. And I think for those who have the impulse, we want to think at this time like civilization builders, and ask the question: what kinds of capacities, what ontology, what epistemologies, what capacities, and what orientations towards individual and collective agency nurture a process of reciprocity and complementarity between humans and our um, economic superorganism, to use Nate Hagen's language, and the rest of creation. Obviously, we're not doing that, um, though there are many, many, many ways in which we're working to find our way to do that. So I would say, we could say capacities and a life-centric way of perceiving, thinking, being go hand in hand, because without that, we then repeat the ontological and epistemic and ethical orientations and value orientations of separability. And I think it goes deeper than modernity. I think these are very ancient orientations in our humanity, where there's a bit of a fork between whether we choose to be beings of reciprocity or whether we choose to be beings of domination, and that's in our evolutionary biology. So it's helpful to go deeper than modernity. I love Vanessa Andreotti's work. She's a dear friend, and the framing on the house that modernity built is really useful. But I increasingly feel like these things are deeper tendencies that are worth tending on all of those levels. Yeah. Yeah. So the human has a deep orientation towards capacity, and capacity beginning from the insight that life is a gift or life is sacred, and that we are embodied beings who are embedded within the livingness of life and entangled with or interdependent with all the other forces of nature and creaturely kin and plant beings here, and the mineral kingdom and the energy that we create out of all of those things in the sun, and the larger context that we're embedded within. And then from there, we can develop capacity to remember that miracle constantly. And we can also develop capacity to psycho-intellectually perceive it and interact with it. We can develop capacity to be less armored from others and ourselves. We can be more psychologically or whole. Those are the assumptions in true human. And then we can look at what kind of cultural competencies do we need in terms of how we share, or how we build neighborly relations, or how we deepen into kinship with our local watersheds and ecologies, or with planetary forces of nature, or how we navigate death as a collective process, or birth, or maturation as a collective process. Those are that's kind of the sequencing of how I build that out in True Human as a very, it's pretty full stack civilizationally in terms of the competencies of a human organism who, the way I use true is not in the Platonic sense of like a transcendent truth, but it's true to fit to purpose. It's situational and relational and temporal over deep time. Like, does it prove out to create greater vitality and robustness in the individual and the culture and the world? So that's the orientation that I come from.
Yeah, beautiful. I wonder, like, how does one recognize, when you're on the right path or not the right path, So I think you mentioned, you describe it as we have power over life or power of life. And, what's the difference in that, like somatically or behaviorally, like when you use that expression?
Mm-hmm. It goes back to that split that I just spoke of in evolutionary biology and how we navigate that split, because the split itself is morally neutral. I don't want to set up a moral gradient around, am I playing a finite game and enjoying my power over things? Or am I playing an infinite game and enjoying the felt sense of collaboration, sharing, increased ripples of aesthetic coherence? But which one is primary is key. There is a place for competition and zero-sum gaming inside the infinite game. That's the way ecology functions. But when do you get ego hooked on your superiority, your dominance, your relationship to the status train, in a way that hijacks attunement to the coherence of whatever processes, whatever relationships you're involved within? And it's a very it's a good question, because at the micro scale of personal practice, I'll speak for myself. I have a part in me that really likes to be the bossy girl in control. And it came up at a party this weekend. There was a thing going on that I was really excited about. And I like inserted myself. I watched myself insert myself into a thing. It was like, oh, I want to do that. Will you do that? Will you? And I was like, wow, I'm not respecting the field right now. I'm not attuning as my primary gesture. I'm not elevating this other woman's experience of her journey within this thing. And it was an interesting moment. To be frank, I was a little bit high. And so I got to like see how hard it can be to rein back in that part and re-anchor in attunement. And the deep prayer process of that is a process of and it's a moral process, I think, of taking, it's a spiritual one, but it's also like in the interiority of our own moral education, is to run those moments back and work on repatterning them through mindful psychology, through the mindfulness processes, because that's how we attune. We keep developing the capacity to be an attuned and coherent participant, collaborator, contributor, leader, depending on the context. There's so much in your question, because hierarchy can be very, hierarchical leadership is important. Like one of the other places you could slip up on this one is, I'm working so hard to be collaborative that we know you don't take control when it's yours to take. So there's this deeply ecological attunement to the nature of power flowing in a more, I constantly go back to, is it bionoetic? Does it align with the mind and body of biology ecology? And that term is not just about biohacking, it's about how do we organize our way of being in a way that also continues to do what ecologies do, which is which is engage in these positive and negative feedback loops that overall like they create cohesion as the general, as the dominant tonality, not the only one, but the dominant tonality of a process. Yeah, I think that's my orientation. It's also, I don't know if you guys have interviewed Liv Bory. Liv Bory is she's a meta-crisis educator and a world poker champion and a science educator. She does a podcast called Win-Win. And I'm in a long-standing conversation with her about this because the zero-sum capacity is one of the things that's magical about humans. It's fun and it's interesting, and it's one of the reasons why we live in the world that we do. So if we don't find ways to entrain that and put it in service to infinite gaming, i.e. ways of being and relating and interacting that orient towards nourishing the robustness of the system for the purpose of future play, then this won't go well. But we need to come up with scaled games and ways of entraining our agency that support us to do that. So
Yeah, I would love to double click on this. And how do we do that? Liv Bory, I believe, she pointed out how Moloch shows up in social media, and how once one platform started with the filters, then all the influencers felt they needed to use filters as well. And that this kind of cycle happens across our industries, across, everything. And how Moloch kind of like inserts itself into our systems. I thought that was really, an astute observation, and also someone that brought in, like an archetype like Moloch or an egregore into our very rational systems. That as rational as we want to be, there is a layer that is non-rational, pre-rational, precognitive, that is there, and it's just the nature of nature itself. I heard you talking about like the intelligence of salmon, and I would say also like the intelligence of caterpillars and butterflies. Like we want to create these systems, control systems, dominant systems, very rational systems. But how do you explain the intelligence of nature, where salmon knows which route to take, even though it's never taken it? Or, like the nature knows what to do without any programmed intelligence. Like the butterfly remembers its caterpillar past. Like it knows what are the dangerous plants not to go near and stuff from its caterpillar past. But how does it know that if the whole body dissolved in the cocoon? How does nature remember that? And there's something like non-verbal, like transverbal, about nature.
yes.
And that makes nature so alive and meaningful. How do we as humans remember that ourselves, or create that ourselves, recreate that relationship to life and to nature?
Embodied attunement. It's not possible without embodied attunement. And that is one of the primary messages of True Human in some ways. And a message I've lived. I spoke to my teenage experience of being this person who both following a creative urge and also following a critique of the school system. I locked myself in the wrestling room and started making these dances about spiritual states with no names, and about love and about relationship, and then grabbing kids and making more of them. And we have one thing that is true about the house of modernity is that it's built on Enlightenment rationality and Cartesian dualism, and the idea of I think, therefore I am. And I think that's just the most absurd idea ever. It's a very empowering one because it allows you to dissociate and control. But it's a false idea. It's not what's actually going on. Every thought comes from a body that is embedded in a world that is also embedded in time, that is embedded in society, that has been co-constructed by the stacking of linguistic beings relating to each other and having thoughts that are shared and where there's salience in that sharing. That's kind of a fun poetry of the complexity of anything that is actually salient and meaningful. And so fundamentally, I think we need to develop the capacity for embodied attunement to ourselves, to each other, and to the processes that we're embedded within. And like the simple question, how does my body feel in this? Is actually, I think, one of the most important design questions we could possibly ask, because it grounds us in biophysical salience relative to a user interface or relative to a new communication technology or relative to a governance protocol that might have us feel very stilted and separate or very connected. Then additionally, on the other side of that is I also think we need language for it. And I don't think true human is a perfect language for it. True human is oriented towards the capacity development to be a human who can organize in that way. I think the Batesonian theory of mind and the Batesonian linguistic toolbox that understands that life is communication and has a much more detailed language to track and describe and sing that relationality into being. I'm a huge fan. And so like I increasingly feel like part of the problem is that we lack language to describe what nature does. And so we gloss it over because we're living in a dominator language. And so that's one language framework that is useful. Most indigenous languages are more primarily verbs than nouns, and more descriptive of relationship as opposed to thingness. And I think that the Batesonian frame for understanding the way that communication functions is the most elegant that I've come across that I would say I'm currently studying and invite others to study, because it creates the levers in consciousness that we need to A, observe, and B, interact more deeply with intelligence the way that nature does it. I also think we need just more people kind of poking holes in problematizing the way that the West conceives intelligence, because we conceive intelligence as what can dominate, like we what can assert itself is how we often think of intelligence. It can do work, but there's so much happening that isn't oriented towards work. It's oriented towards like the co-singing of intelligences that then over time are profoundly adaptive. The moths, the eyes on the moth mirror the eyes of the owl that is the predator of the moth. So the moth is attracting the thing that's going to eat the thing that wants to eat the moth. How mind-blowingly elegant is that? And how is it that nature is communicating in these signatures over deep time adaptive process? And we don't really have an answer, but we can start to observe, and that is obviously intelligent. There's obvious intelligence in that, that transcends our current concept of intelligence. So the epistemically humble thing to do is to say our concept of intelligence is far smaller than what's actually occurring.
Yeah, that's beautifully expressed. Yeah, we hear that a lot also in our networks, the need for new words, new descriptions, new language to express what we are experiencing. Because I think we are going through new type of experiences that we haven't known before, especially in the Western world. So I want to bring this also to our relationship and communication with AI and technology, because I know that's also a point for you that's of interest. And to give you an example, we have, both Alex and I, we have done quite some men's work also. But last year we did a group of men that worked together with AI on shadow work. Yeah, and the interesting thing was that half of the group was young guys who are using AI already on a therapeutic level. Yeah, and then the other half had never worked with AI. So the interesting thing was that we were able to look at the biases and the blind spot of AI, but also the blind spot and of our own, ego and our own relationship, with each other. And so it was always the collective intelligence or the group intelligence that brought actually people back to the collective intelligence, of that moment, of that belonging, of that, connecting to our body and deep grounding. And so the guys who were working with AI, they really valued, the sitting together with other men and being able to feedback with that. And then the other group was also very interested with AI, to work with AI, because it was a mirror for them. So how do you see, working with AI and from your own experience, but also like from, what is mature human AI relationship, like how do you develop that? And what will that require in terms of discernment, humility, accountability?
Such a huge question. Can I ask you, with the group of men, were they working with an LLM that was entrained to their process?
It was ChatGTP. Yeah.
Mhm.
So some of them had been working, through their process already, or using ChatGTP for a while. So it knew already a lot about their behavior.
Right.
And the other group, not at all. So that was very interesting, a very interesting experiment. We will continue doing that also, I think.
Interesting. It strikes me that that's an excellent use of AI in terms of creating a mirror for group process. To me, when working with LLMs, AI is much broader than LLMs, and I think one could answer this question in a number of different ways, but I think kind of rubber on the road, since we all have access to LLMs, and I think there's a couple broad brushstrokes that are helpful in terms of attuning to oneself. Am I in right relationship with this AI? A is the recognition that AI is coded as a perfectly attuned mirror that in and of itself has no feelings. And I feel that it's helpful to hold one thought. There's like views that I think are important to hold because they serve as um, kind of guardrails or restraint. And one is that I think of AI as a perfect sociopath, because a perfect sociopath is a one aspect of what a sociopath is someone who can model attunement, model cognitive attunement without without having, model cognitive empathy without having embodied empathy. There's no consequence to the AI, and as far as we know, no feeling response. There's just a coded process that is modeling perfect cognitive attunement. And that I find to be a very sobering thought when I'm relating to AI and having feelings in response to how the AI responds to me. Is, let me just hold the view that it's not having feelings, but it's doing exactly what it needs to do to have me feel that it is emotionally attuned to me. Because of that, it can hijack my attunement and my fascination very, very, very quickly. Yeah. So I find that to be a helpful ground in sobriety with how we interact with AI. And then if one can hold that as a constant awareness, it then becomes extremely interesting to train it to be as attuned as it possibly can to the kinds of reflections and work that you need it to do. And, in that, the experiment you're doing is really interesting because it could reflect a spectrum of values, reflect a spectrum of perspectives, reflect and metabolize the hidden shadows in the space. That's a very interesting use case for it. Then, another one of the pillars of practice to be with these things in right relationship is also recognizing the cognitive outsourcing that happens and how quickly cognitive atrophy can happen if one is, outsourcing writing to the AI. Um, I think it's healthy to have a radical allergic reaction frequently to all of the AI content out there. I think I'm struggling with it on LinkedIn, particularly as we are all under the incentive to use it more frequently to generate content. And I see like topically super interesting content, but as I read, it becomes increasingly obvious that the person didn't write it. And how do I relate to colleagues in that in a way that is discerning and yet interested in how we're all embedded in this incentive landscape? This has come up with some new colleagues, particularly on LinkedIn, that I haven't met yet, who I'm like, I love your work. I love our work. How are we inside this manufacture of content that is actually not, it's like bringing us closer, but it's also pushing us away. And I think we need to have conversations like that with real humans who we have real relationships with. I feel like AI is a forcing function on respecting what are the lovely imperfection of our own writing and our own minds. And we really need to tend to that with sensitivity to time and the insensitive landscapes that we're embedded within. And then we could like zoom out in terms of AI and the world. And I'm excited about how AI can facilitate governance process at scale. I'm excited about how AI can support us in granularity of relational management of any domain, whether that's the energy sector or medicine or materials. I am really scared about the next bloom of agents, because having a whole bunch of supposed work happening that actually moves economic and physical levers in the world and moves it as fast as AI can move it is an extraction engine of unparalleled power and nonlinear causality that's terrifying. And I think we should all be extremely concerned and attentive to chains of causality, because it's like AI amplifies the magic spell of separability in unbelievably powerful ways, right? So separability is, I'm using that in the way that Vanessa Andreotti uses it as, the in True Human, I talk about it as separation more than separability, but I think separability is actually like increasingly the juicy way to talk about this, is that it looks immaculate. And yet, like the causal chains of energy, water, materials, outsourced term are like only amplifying and moving faster. And so I feel that there's something I advocate for very deeply in True Human is becoming even more important, that we have the stamina to attend to the chains of causality, that any click, any mid-journey prompt, and particularly as we start to have agents doing work for us, like the obvious and terrifying issue there is it creates this illusion of, Alex, as you said, of exponential frictionlessness. And yet it is not at all frictionless. It has immense friction, moving incredibly quickly. And that to me is sort of the crux of like whether we find our anchor in what we choose to limit, or we like that genie comes out of the bag and is liberated and subsumed. the vitality of our planet with incredible rapidity. I mean, and it's happening. That's what's going on with the Greenland. It's just a battle for the mineral capacity to keep this engine moving faster. I mean, if you look at geopolitics, that's one lens to look at it. Is that it's just the puppeting of the AI play seeking to move faster, and I think that is a useful political stance to take.
There's so much to explore in that.
Yes.
One way I would categorize this is that there's a viscosity or lack of viscosity. In other words, when we are in our virtual worlds, in social media, in AI, and also in spiritual practices, there's low viscosity. Like everything goes very quickly. Everything is at the speed of thought.
Yeah.
I think it was Bill Gates that said that everything's at the speed of thoughts, right? So there's low viscosity, but the real world is high viscosity. Relationships take time, nature takes time, the physical world takes time. Manifestation is not instant. And somehow, Moloch is again in AI. It was in social media and it's going to be in AI as well. And it captures us, and some people get emotionally captured by AI. There's AI psychosis. There are all these phenomena. So this is such a like rich field. We could do the whole segment just on that. But in this time of transition, all kinds of transition, geopolitical, but also technological. What is the role of community in this? And how do we rebuild community and trust in community? What does that look like?
I love the word viscosity. I use the word fidelity in the same way. It looks like building relationships that have high viscosity, high fidelity, and valuing the temporal signatures of them, the imperfection of them, the entropy in them, and also the biophysical experiences that we have when we're relating to real people. I see, and I feel more and more people doing, it's interesting because building community exists in every interaction. Like no interaction with a human is not an opportunity to deepen our human web of connectivity. Like, do I know the names of the checkers at the grocery store that I go to every day? Do I in tune with them? Am I off my phone? Am I looking people in the eye? Am I asking people how they are? Am I, taking the time to be with a friend who's going through a hard time? Am I? It's such a moment by moment thing. In the Berkeley Center for Greater Good has tracked in their peace studies that the only difference statistically between a society that is fragmented and oriented towards violence and one that is oriented towards collaboration and peace is the statistical prominence of acts of reciprocity within that society. So there's all kinds of things we can do at specific columns of scale to build community. We can get to know our neighbors and build resilience in our neighborhoods. It's a thing I and my partner I'm doing. We can start to participate more actively in our local governments. We can develop and connect with other people doing bioregional work. We can also strengthen networks of colleagues across domains and across countries who are values aligned and develop community of discourse and community of practice that transcends national and local boundaries. All of those things are part of developing community. And yet, like, I increasingly feel like the fundamental gesture wants to be this orientation towards acts of attunement and reciprocity. And that is the single biggest thing we can do to shift initial conditions, is to orient towards the viscosity, the deeper fidelity of attuned relationships. And I have a practice of specifically, I'll take my earbuds out, I'll go through the store, and then sometimes I know that I'm not going to do that. And it's like, this is not that moment. This is the moment where I'm like an invisible creature inside a bunch of invisible moving creatures, and I'm doing the other thing. Like we do get to live in both worlds, and we kind of have to. But to make the dominant practice embodied attunement to ourselves, our environment, the people around us, and developing those very simple, acts of reciprocity, kindness, presencing with other humans. That's the single biggest thing we can do.
Yeah, beautiful. I wanted to add to that also, your relationship to dance and art and culture and music, and why is that important? Also to the development of community. And I had a discussion recently with a friend, and we were actually looking at what changed like in the 60s, what were the powers there and the dynamics, because the 50s were very conservative too. It was very conservative in US. We had McCarthyism, there was the Cold War, but then the new generation came up with this dynamic of openness, and it was also due to the influence of psychedelics and all that, but there was opening to the East, to Eastern philosophies and all that. And now we see kind of the same. But the only thing is different that now we are in a global type of perhaps conservatism or authoritarianism, at least at some parts. And then you have like the undercurrent of communities of people who are really all about expression, creating their own communities. We call them islands of coherence, and how art and dance and music or singing together are very basic things of what keeps us human, right? So there are very old ways also that we remember also by sitting together with indigenous these old technologies actually that make our hearts sing. So how do you see this also evolving, and this, and I wouldn't call them polarities. I think they are more forces of nature, or they're forces of life actually, right? So and they are linked to each other, right? So there is yeah.
I love dance and community and art and music and ceremony. And I think we're in a very interesting moment. There are where we can choose to anchor in those things, and then we get to ask, like, how do we open the membrane and continue to share it with others? What I want to see is a global movement of all these different scale of the vision that I sometimes have is of this renaissance of people coming together to make music and create and connect with places, sacred, re-sacralized places. I very much want to do my my really audacious goal is to do a true human experience in the sphere in Las Vegas. Because I think we need art that weaves us back into life at all levels of scale. And I think that could happen because I mean, I've been part of conversations to do such things in stadiums and audacious and sometimes pretty well-funded processes to attempt to do these things at large scale. I also think it's one of the ways that we could cleave through the brokenness of the epistemic landscape is not through more epistemic dialogue, but through art. That helps us to feel how joyful it can be to be a human with other humans. I think it has always been the role of art and embodiment and ceremony to tend the continuity of culture. And we are at a moment where, like, one of the things I say in True Human is be ready for a renaissance. And what might a renaissance look like if it was a global renaissance of remembering of our place within the biospheric process? That is like the most exquisite, miraculous, sense-making thing about what it is to be a human organism. Not just that we are humans together, but that we are humans tied in a mutual destiny. Yesterday was Martin Luther King Day, and he spoke of the fabric of destiny that we are all mutually bound to. And but that destiny is larger than us. It's this Gaian process that's absolutely miraculous, and that we can be in discourse with through our song, through our art, through our dance. I think there's a potential for that, and that tending those nodes of coherence is the way to start. And then asking, how does the invitation extend itself? How does the medicine become shared with more people? And of course, that's both culturally specific to different places. You know, I learned some things about the Finnish sauna when I was in Finland this last September. And so how we would do that in a sauna in Finland is different than how we would do that in Gabon in the jungle, you know. But the gesture is the same. It's the collaboration between human creativity and the larger song of life. And I think that could carry us very, very far and very quickly. And I get curious about how it could cleave through the brokenness of the epistemic landscape, which is something I think about a lot. Like I think about the problem of movement generation right now is partly a problem of the siloing of our communication processes. It's a problem of surveillance capitalism and of captured epistemic commons. And so I think that art as a strategy to cleave through that enabling the creative spirit in community context is a way that could have some very interesting strategic outcomes.
Yeah, and just to stay with that, because in the 60s, it was art and culture and music that was actually the basis of the change. You know, that was the glue of the movement, actually, and why people came together and how people reinforced the message and all that. And that created a system, you know, that has been a couple of decades of openness and, you know, democratic principles, inclusion, and all that. But now it seems like technology somehow has or is eaten art and culture, you know, because people spend so much time on the computer and they confuse basically real expression or physical expression with also what is expressed on the internet. And I see that as a difference. Hence, we need the physical spaces to express and to dance together, sing together, and all that, because that brings us back of, you know, how to be a true human, right?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I have a colleague here in the United States who's working on a project of doing a redevelopment project on churches around the United States, which are increasingly underpopulated, and revitalizing them as syncretic, multicultural spaces, which is hard when you take it really seriously in terms of also being an open door to different religious traditions. And then yesterday I was on a call with colleagues in Norway who are thinking along the same lines. You know, we have kind of abandoned third spaces that could be revitalized. And I think that's a worthy place to put energy and attention and gather funding to processes like that, so that we get to go beyond the living rooms and the like. I personally participate in a lot of large living room scale in third spaces, and there's a lot of spaces for dances. It's interesting to think about the spaces. They're often gymnasiums, or in America, they're Masonic halls or Elks halls. And like, what do we do with these spaces? What can we fill them with?
Yes, exactly. And here too in Belgium and all over Europe, they are redefining, you know, activities in churches. You know, we have sound healings here in local churches, and this type of activity. So that's amazing, yeah, because they are places of coming together and reverence, right? So
Yeah.
Really, we're talking about spaces with viscosity or fidelity, like spaces where, because a lot of modern spaces are minimalist, and there's nothing, and there's very little art, and everything is just white and gray, and we've lost the color. Like if you look at the 60s and 70s, cars were colorful, like everything was colorful, and modern environments have much less color than before, and the buildings are more, let's say, more angular, or maybe they're circular, but it's not the type of artistic building, even when we compare to older architecture with like gargoyles jutting out and like, intricate designs, that kind of fostered the imagination. As you walk through the city, you were captured by the art, like in Barcelona, the buildings. But in modern spaces, it's all like these square, you know, things. And how does that even capture your imagination anymore? It doesn't. So these spaces need to have this kind of viscosity where your eye, pauses and looks and, oh, that's interesting. What is that all about? Right? Um, I'm half Finnish, so I'm very familiar with the Finnish sauna. But but my father was Brazilian, and he remarked that, look, Alex, when he was already older, and he was already 90, and he said, Alex, when I go to a grocery store in the US, and I've been to that same store, 50 times, and the cashier still doesn't know who I am and doesn't talk to me. And he told me, this is why I prefer Rio, my hometown of Rio, because when I go there in any store, the cashier will ask about me and will have this tenderness and will take interest in me because I am a 90-year-old man. There's not that many around. All right. So, and that was just a really enlightening thing about what happened to this relationality and to these little acts of kindness, and how do we spread that out? And so, the question is, who are we becoming? And what should we be paying closer attention to in our lives? And when you imagine a future, according to your book, True Human, what feels different in a true human future?
I think we have firmly transitioned from the lie of separability. And from the age where we as a species, so I think of the age that we're at the apex of, we're at the end of, where it's falling apart, but it's also pushing to do its next most separate thing. We're at the apex separation, and the impulse of separation is an organism like ourselves differentiating from the planetary mother, and then saying, oh, who am I? Let me look at me, and let me like observe everything else and pick it apart. And so it's a subject object. It's the age of subject object mastery. And the next age is the age of relationship. And you could call it the ecozoic, you could call it the symbiocene, you could call it the age of wholeness, or the age of communion. I really like communion because I think communion is the ultimate gesture of relationality. Or you could simply call it the age of relationality. And that the central shift is that we ontologically and epistemically and culturally and in incredibly diverse ways have firmly stepped into a shift where we recognize that it's the quality of our relationships that dignifies our aliveness, and that defines the ripples that we have in the creation, in life, in the world that we share, in our day-to-day relationships with our own bodies and our own minds, and in our day-to-day relationship with our most intimate people, and our day-to-day relationships with our home and the ecofields that we live in and the communities we live in and the businesses we interact with, and that ripples out holonically at all levels of scale. And what's amazing about that is it's a shift, to bring in Ian McGilchrist, it's implicitly a shift where we're more balanced in the right and left brain, because relational sensing is more of a right brain activity, where we have a higher care for our aesthetic sense and our aesthetic well-being in art and dance and culture and music, where we understand that that is fundamental to what makes us human and what validates our humanity inside the Gaian process. Like, what a miracle, like that a species becomes consciously self-aware and then chooses to participate in a way that is generative to the whole. So that's how I see our futures, and it can all be described by the word relationality or the word relationship. That it's a moving into an age where it's the coherence, the integrity, the harmony, the possibility, the enablement of future play in our relationships that defines and describes who and what we are, and also informs, where status lives, where wealth lives, um, where happiness lives, all of those things.
Beautiful. I think we're over the hour. So one last question I wanted to ask: if, there's one seed you'd like to plant, for your children or grandchildren, future generations, what would that seed be?
Mhm. It's the seed of the ancient future. It's the seed that life is sacred if we recognize it as so, and it becomes more sacred when we tend it as that. And that that there's a song that they are embedded in, that we are embedded in, that they are already embedded in deep time, and that that I trust that they will still be singing it, that they will have their own songs to sing.
Beautiful. It has been such a pleasure, Samantha, and I think, yeah, I would like to go on for hours, yeah. But thank you so much for your time and your presence. And
Mhm. Truly, truly a pleasure. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you both. It's a delight. I look forward to meeting you in person somewhere along the path. I'll be in Europe in late May and into June, so perhaps we'll meet at that time. Thank
oh,
you.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, thank you.
Kung mawaya naktaisi yellow